Welcome to the College of Human Sciences and Humanities Presents, a video-based lecture series featuring the work of faculty from the largest of the four colleges at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. I'm Interim Dean Samuel Gladden. The College of HSH features almost 30 academic programs at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels. Our disciplines are diverse, and our remarkable faculty are committed to innovation, intersectionality, interdisciplinarity, and collaborations in research with other faculty and students. The work of our faculty exemplifies cutting-edge scholarship that is directly responsive to issues that beset us in politics, culture, and health. As you will see in this video series, our faculty are collegial and collaborative, and they are deeply invested in the work of their colleagues, as the cross-departmental pairings of moderators and presenters in this series demonstrate. For more information on our college or any of the work featured in this series, write to us at hsh@uhcl.edu. And now, the College of Human Sciences and Humanities presents.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Mike McMullen. I'm a professor of sociology here, and we'll introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Keith Parsons was born in Georgia and lived the first 30 years in the Atlanta area. He still thinks of Georgia as his home, and the last election encouraged him to think that it is no longer under Confederate control. He has earned 2 doctorates, 2 master's degrees, and a bachelor's. His doctoral work was in the fields of philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, and the history of science. He's published in those fields as well as logic and critical thinking and social and political philosophy. In his academic career, he has resisted the pressures towards hyper-specialization and has always appreciated the fact that UHCL allowed him to pursue his eclectic and eccentric interests. UHCL got 2 for 1 in hiring Dr. Parsons, both as a philosopher and a historian. In his career at UHCL, his goals have been to publish copiously, to teach enthusiastically, and to avoid committee work whenever possible. He sees his academic responsibilities as extending not from just his colleagues and students, but also to the broader public. Therefore, he takes very seriously the importance of the public intellectual, one who draws upon specialized academic training to make contributions on salient public issues. One issue that very much concerns him and which motivates tonight's presentation and his current book project is the defamation and politicization of science in our culture. For him, as for Carl Sagan, science is a candle in the dark, a fragile and precious field of light in the gloom of superstition and ideology. That is why he has taken up the cudgels against the detractors of science. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Keith Parsons.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mike. I do appreciate that. I want to start my talk about how much I love science by saying how much I hate technology. I've just gone blank here. Something has happened. I've just gone out here. I've got no picture. I've got nothing.
Keith, we still hear and see you on our end.
You can still see? Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah, the screen just went blank on me. Here it is back again. Okay. Yeah, let me start my presentation by saying how much I hate technology because things like that happen all the time. Anyway, let me begin by saying, by recalling a few things. I'm old enough now to remember when science had a very different status in our culture. when I was a kid growing up in the late 50s and early 60s, science was everything, just about. People love science, liberal and conservative, Republicans and Democrats. Even growing up in the deep South, I heard nothing against science, not even against evolutionary theory. All of my teachers were for it. The STEM fields got such tremendous support. I think the reason basically was that when I was in kindergarten in October of 1957, Sputnik was launched by the Russians. And of course, this caused great consternation on the part of American officials. There was much hand-wringing about American kids falling behind, while all these Russian whiz kids were specializing in calculus and rocket science. Our teenagers were zoning out on cheeseburgers, drive-in movies, and rock and roll. So they put a tremendous emphasis upon the STEM fields when I got into school, and I loved it. Like many nerdy kids, my earliest academic interest, my earliest intellectual interest was dinosaurs, all right? I loved dinosaurs and still had a tremendous collection of toy dinosaurs. Still do, let me get some. I still have my T-Rex and my Triceratops, okay? Much better toys than I had when I was a kid. And so I still go for the dinosaur toys. I don't make them fight anymore, at least not when anyone is looking. All right, all of us, of course, reflecting back on the history of science in our culture, can recall certain things that for us were incredibly positive and encouraging and uplifting. Other things which were frightening, destructive, even terrifying. One of my earliest memories in science is standing in line to get the Sabine vaccine for polio. People beneath a certain age now can barely conceive of what a terror polio was, how every summer parents lived in abject fear that this hideous, paralyzing disease would strike their children, as it so often did. Dr. Jonas Salk, working at my alma mater, the University of Pittsburgh, came up with a wonderful vaccine that has ended the threat of polio for people my age and younger. Crystal, if you would show the video that we have from YouTube on the polio vaccine and how, what a great thing it was, I would appreciate it if you can show that now.
If you were born after the mid-50s, you don't know what polio was.
What it was terrifying. Before the polio vaccine, the virus would leave a healthy person weak or paralyzed and in excruciating pain in a matter of hours.
Summertime was full of terror for parents. In 1952, for instance, 57,000, mainly children, came down with polio, and generally during the summer months, July, August, a little bit of June, September, and you still see people who suffer the effects of having had the disease. It was terrifying.
And so was the treatment. The iron lung was a metal tube which used air pressure to inflate and deflate the lungs of paralyzed patients, and it was a miserable existence.
Being confined in this long metal tube for days at a time, not really being able to have any human contact, not being able to move much. It seemed like the most awful thing that could conceivably happen.
But then the most wonderful thing anyone could conceive of happened. In 1952, Jonas Salk developed an effective vaccine, and by 1954, children were lined up everywhere to get it. This community vaccination was held inside the studio at KPLR in 1960. Though the disease has been for the most part eradicated, one vestige still remains, the March of Dimes, started by President Franklin Roosevelt, who himself was a victim of polio.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, that shows that, you know, what a terrible thing polio was and what a wonderful triumph of science it was to overcome it. but also, of course, from back in those days, in addition to the polio vaccine and the Apollo program, and the landing on the moon, which, again, was so wonderful, there were some things which were frankly terrifying, such as the development of thermonuclear weapons. The greatest explosion created by the United States was the Castle Bravo test, which is on March 1st of 1954 on the island of Bikini in the Pacific testing grounds. They detonated a thermonuclear device. It was estimated to have a yield of about 6 megatons, 6 million tons of ordinary explosive, conventional explosive. It ran away to 15 megatons, which caused tremendous problems. Many of the native Marshallese on nearby islands were severely irradiated. The crewmen of the Lucky Dragon, a Japanese fishing boat, about 75 miles from Bikini, were also terribly irradiated, which caused an enormous furor in Japan, which is understandable since Japan to this day is the only nation ever to have gone atomic attack in warfare. All right, Crystal, if you would show the Castle Bravo test. This is quite short. Okay, the Castle Bravo test was of such extreme power that the detonation crew, which detonated the device from a steel reinforced concrete bunker over 20 miles away, after the device was detonated, the steel reinforced concrete walls began to shake and groan, and the entire structure began to rock like a ship at sea. Quite a terrifying event. So science has also, of course, unleashed enormous destructive power, tremendous, inconceivable. Hydrogen bombs are the ultimate weapons. We can make them as big as we want. Okay, all you have to do is add more fuel. Nevertheless, despite the terrifying aspects of science, science was the most trusted, the most believed in, the most accepted branch of human inquiry without question, I thought. Then, back in the 1980s and 90s, I became appalled, alarmed, when I heard that science was under attack by many academics of the so-called academic left, as it was called. Attacks from the left seem very odd. I mean, science had always been attacked by ideologues of the right. You had creationists and other people that attacked science from the right, but attacks from the left were very odd, it seemed to me. You had people like the social constructivists, such as Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar, Chapin and Schaefer, the authors of perhaps the most well-known book of social constructivism called Leviathan and the Air Pump. All right. And so these people seem to be claiming some very strange things, things I found practically incomprehensible, namely that science, not only in its discoveries, not only in its results, but also in its methods and techniques, was purely and simply a social construct through and through. That is, that the results and methods of science had no objective validity. Science could not be called true in any sort of objective sense, but simply reflected the social and political ambience and milieu of the particular time and place. For instance, Chapin and Schaeffer said that when Robert Boyle and others discovered the air pump and began the experimental method in science in the 17th century, that they were opposed by the old philosopher Thomas Hobbes, famous for writing the political treatise Leviathan, and that, of course, experimental science with Robert Boyle and the Royal Society triumphed. But Chapin and Schaeffer said that it did not triumph because experimental methods are in fact superior, which they are. They said that it triumphed because of the political advantages that Robert Boyle and his allies had, whereas Thomas Hobbes was a despised atheist, as he was considered at the time. So I thought this was very strange and didn't have much time to pay attention to it, but some other people did. In 1994, a brilliant polemic was published called Higher Superstition by Paul Gross and Norman Levitt, which basically pulled no punches, making a quite acerbic and trenchant critique of the academic left. Well, this was not enough for some people. The physicist Alan Sokal decided that something more needed to be done. So what he did was he composed an essay called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutic of Quantum Gravity. Okay, that title alone should have gotten it published. Anyway, he sent it to the journal Social Text. Social Text was the main, I guess you would say, the hub for publishing by the academic left, for publishing the various critiques of science. And he filled his article with all sorts of gibberish and scientific and mathematical howlers and presented it to them as a legitimate publication, as a legitimate article. Well, they published it in 1996 as a legitimate article. Sokal immediately revealed the hoax, and he took this as showing that the editors of Social Text and the people who published these critiques of science were themselves scientific ignoramuses, or even worse, did not care if the content was bad so long as it promoted their ideology, all right? Needless to say, this produced an enormous imbroglio, which became known as the Science Wars, all right? The Science Wars. And Stanley Fish, famous literary critic, who was the editor of Social Text at the time, he was, of course, deeply incensed and was very angry that Sokal had published that he had played such a nasty, devious trick. And he accused him of basically using a Trojan horse to embarrass colleagues, that sort of thing. Sokal, as he saw it, felt that it was entirely justified. It was completely a justified tactic to use to reveal the sloppiness and the ideological bias of the critics of science. All right. Okay. Well, as I say, that was just one aspect of the critique of science that we saw beginning in the 80s and 90s. Of much greater concern, perhaps, and perhaps far more threatening to science, has been the attack by big money interests, okay? Large corporations began to see science, or at least particular sciences such as climatology, as threatening their bottom lines, okay? As threatening their profits, in particular climate science, with the discoveries that had been made about human-caused global warming and climate change. This certainly appeared to threaten the profits of fossil fuel companies, coal, oil, natural gas. And they decided to then attack the science. What do you do when science says that what you're doing is horribly harmful to the entire planet? Do you change your ways? No. You attack the science. And actually, it turns out that attacking the science is alarmingly, disturbingly easy to do. There was a comic by Dilbert, Scott Adams, who does Dilbert, that showed how easy it is to do. The evil CEO of the comic Dilbert, Dogbert, goes into a shop called Rent a Weasel, and he says, "I would like to hire 3 unsuccessful and embittered scientists and 100 lazy journalists." And the Rent-A-Weasel says, "Consider it done." The final panel shows Dilbert reading a newspaper headline that said, "Toddlers thrive on pollution." Okay, that shows how easily you can publish bogus science, if you have enough money to hire your own researchers and to fund your own think tanks, which of course these people do. Unfortunately, now we have all sorts of bogus institutes and think tanks that present themselves as communities of scholars, but are in fact ideologues in the pay of vested interests who put out all sorts of skewed statistics, misinformation, disinformation, and that sort of thing to delay or prevent the science from being heard. In fact, obscuring science is a big business now. One of these companies that is involved in doing this says, doubt is our product. That is what we sell, doubt. We know that this works, and the big oil, big gas, big coal knows that it works because it worked for big tobacco. During the 1950s and on into the early 60s, evidence began to mount that tobacco, that cigarette smoking, caused lung cancer and all sorts of other terrible maladies. Again, how did big tobacco react? They reacted by attacking the science, okay, by hiring their own researchers and doing their own so-called research, all right? And the tactic was extremely successful. They were able to delay any significant regulation of the cigarette industry for years and years and years, during which time they made profits beyond the dreams of avarice. All right, so that's what they did. So science is under attack. And of course, the right wing also continues to maintain its various attacks on science. Creationism is still very much alive. And its dressed up cousin, intelligent design theory. They're both still very much alive, being pursued by well-funded, very dedicated people that are continuing to produce their arguments against evolution. Also, of course, the ideological right and ideological libertarians have lined up with the vested interest against climate science. It has become so bad, and science has become so deeply politicized, that we have seen just in this past terrible year what it has led to. Friends, it seems to me that there's no more shocking indication of what has happened to the status of science in our culture than to realize that we are so divided, so polarized politically, that we could not even unite behind the science to fight a pandemic that has killed 500,000 of us, all right? That has killed more Americans than any war since the Civil War. And we could not unite. It has come to the point that I saw a statistic just yesterday that said 49% of Republican men say that they will not get the COVID vaccinations. They will not get it, okay? So where you stand on things such as vaccinations, such as evolution, such as climate science, that becomes a litmus test for your politics. Now, this is absurd, and I think things have gotten terribly out of hand. Therefore, those of us who love science, who think that it is perhaps the greatest accomplishment of concerted human ingenuity, we need to do something about it. So what can we do about it? Well, I think that's why, believe it or not, I'm writing a book on that very topic, of course. All right. And in my book, what I'm attempting to do is to go back and take a look at some of the arguments that sprang up during the science wars and say, what has gone wrong? How, for instance, do you address the people who are social constructivists, who say that it's politics that determines the methods of science, that those who wield the influence, often privileged white males who wield the influence, are the ones who are able to determine the course of science, the very methods and techniques of science, rather than what we normally think of as objective tests and measures and that sort of thing. And so I think that those arguments, they're still out there, they're still current, they have not been laid to rest, and I think they need to. I think that the way to address these sorts of issues is not by philosophical argument, but by looking at the actual history of science, which belies these sorts of analyses. One of my favorite figures in the history of astronomy is one by the name of Henrietta Swan Leavitt, whose dates, I believe, were 1868 to 1921. She was at the Harvard Observatory. Back in those days, computers were women. A computer in those days was someone who was given the arduous task of doing the grunt work, of doing, the work which the astronomers, all high status males, did not have the time, the leisure, or the inclination to do. All right, so Ms. Leavitt spent her time looking at charts, photographs of stars, and with a great deal of dedication and a great deal of patience, testing their brightness and this sort of thing. Well, one of the problems that we've always had in astronomy is we have no idea. We had no idea how far things were in space. If something looks bright and something else looks dim, does that mean that the bright thing is close and the dim thing is far away? Or is the bright thing far away, but just of intrinsic brightness, and the dim thing close by, but just intrinsically dim? No one had any way to know. What we needed was a standard candle, some standard measure whereby we could tell what the intrinsic magnitude, the intrinsic brightness of a star was. Nobody had been able to solve that. Ms. Leavitt found it. By studying the stars in the small Magellanic Cloud, Magellanic clouds are visible in the far southern hemisphere. I've only seen them once in my life. The small Magellanic Cloud is about 175,000 light years away. It's a satellite galaxy to our Milky Way. And she noticed that a certain type of star called a Cepheid variable star within this had a strong correlation between its periodicity, that is, its variation between maximum and minimum brightness, and its intrinsic brightness. The longer the period, the greater its intrinsic brightness was. How did she know that it related to the intrinsic as opposed to the apparent brightness? Simple. The Magellanic Clouds are so far away with reference to us and are so compact in their own volume that every star in there, or that all the stars in there, must be reflecting their brightness must reflect their true magnitude, not simply their apparent magnitude, since they're all approximately the exact same distance away. Well, she worked this out mathematically, of course, and established a mathematical relationship, which she published. That's not quite right. She didn't get to publish it by herself. Her boss, Professor Pickering, he insisted that his name be at the top of the publication, okay? And other high-status male astronomers also ripped off her discovery and tried to claim it for their own. Now, I submit to you, friends, that when a low-status woman working at an observatory has her discovery ripped off, or attempted to be ripped off by higher status males, that she's owned to something. It's not politics, it's not influence, It's not that she had a high status so that she could browbeat others. She had none of those things. What she had done is made a remarkable discovery, and she made it by her own intelligence and dedication and sharp eyes, okay? She didn't appeal to politics. So I think that the thing we have to do is to actually look at the history of science, all right? I think that's better than the actual philosophical argumentation. We'll make just one more brief point before I, turn it over to everyone else and get some questions here, turning over to Mike, then to everyone else and get some questions. Pretty much modern skepticism about science goes back to one book, amazingly, one book. It is this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas S. Kuhn, okay, published in 1962. Thomas Kuhn is probably the most influential writer on science, for at least the last 100 years. He is the one who famously came up with the idea of paradigms. Now, you know that you're a famous philosopher of science when some of your jargon penetrates into popular culture. In the 1990s, about 30 years after the publication of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, I began to see commercials on television that talked about a new paradigm, language which had come from Thomas Kuhn's work in the philosophy of science 30 years before. It took it that long to percolate through the various layers of our culture. Kuhn is taken, let me emphasize, is taken by many as showing that the objectivity of science is impossible and that scientists change their minds not for rational reasons, but by undergoing something like, very much like, in fact, he even uses the word a conversion, okay? That like someone who, like St. Augustine, sitting in the garden, or John Wesley, who was walking home at night after meeting with some German pietists. They have an overwhelming spiritual experience and everything changes. And Kuhn was taken as saying that, yes, that is how scientists change their mind. When I was initially researching this, I got in touch with David Raup, probably the greatest paleontologist in my not so humble opinion of the 20th century. He had changed his mind, he said, and even spoke of it as a kind of conversion. I told him, Professor Raup, this is personal communication with him. I've read your articles before and after your conversion. I don't see a conversion, all right? And he said, this is, what he said to me is that it felt like a conversion. My submission then is that the experience of conversion is a subjective one. And that what actually defines your science is the methods you use, the arguments you use, the mathematical techniques, and that sort of thing. And pre-conversion, Professor Raup, and post-conversion, Professor Raup, were very much on the same page, okay? So once again, with Thomas Kuhn, we have to look at the actual history of science, what actually happens. And what we find is that science does not conform to this idea that there is a massive paradigm shift in which scientists of the previous era can no longer even communicate with the post-paradigm scientists. Indeed, that their language is incommensurable with each other, as Kuhn says. Nonsense, utter nonsense. Kuhn himself wrote earlier about the Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution took 150 years to complete, and it was argued out every step of the way. And the people arguing were not talking past each other. They were making contact with each other and arguing about substantial issues. Professor Kuhn is famous for saying the very opening words of his book is that the philosophy of science would be done very differently if we took the history of science seriously. That's where I take him very seriously. And so I say that we look at the actual practice of science and we find that at least how Kuhn has been interpreted, at least how he has been taken, is wrong. Interestingly enough, Professor Kuhn himself in his later years seemed to regret some of the more extreme things that were at least attributed to him. I have a book of commentary on Kuhn that talks about it. It says Kuhn, from revolutionary to social democrat. That when he was young and wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he was a revolutionary, right on, okay? But then as an older man, when he was reflecting on things, he became a very moderate social democrat, who at that point said that incommensurability, the lack of communication between those of an old paradigm and new, is only partial and is rare. I take that essentially as saying, it doesn't happen. Okay, well, that's just, hey, if you want the whole story, it's a very simple solution. Buy my book, okay? Only $29.95 at your local seller, Routledge Press, 2022. Reserve your copy now, okay? All right, Mike, I'll turn it over to you and to any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Dr. Parsons. This was a great presentation, very interesting. I've got a couple observations and then a question. One is very specific and one is kind of general. It was interesting watching the nuclear explosion. It brought back things I remembered from my childhood. I grew up in Fremont, Nebraska, which was 30 miles away from Offutt Air Force Base, Strategic Air Command. And so that's where the nuclear bombers would make their flights every morning. And you could see the contrails at about 6 in the morning, knowing, okay, there's nuclear weapons flying above my head. And we knew that that part of Nebraska is in the top 5 bombing sites of the Soviet Union. So yeah, the memories of some of the fear of that time came back, and I always paid attention to was it the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and they would keep that clock about, are we 3 minutes before midnight or 2 minutes, or maybe if the political situation eased a bit, we were 5 minutes before midnight. But just kind of the fear generated from that time period. The more general observation is I study the sociology of religion, and one of the paradigms, to use Kuhn's words, is looking at the increasing secularization of Western society, the decline of the influence of religion, which is paradoxical because religion often is the challenger of the veracity of science. But it's part of the larger kind of decline in our faith in institutions in general. You know, trust in government has been going down since then, trust in religion, and then trust in science. So it's kind of part of this larger institutional decline, I guess, or institutional challenge. I'm not sure. I just saw a statistic yesterday that for the first time in American history, less than half of the American population are members of a religious denomination or a religious a church, a synagogue, or a mosque or something. So attendance had been declining for the last 40 years, but now membership is under 50%. So just kind of, yeah, first time ever that they've measured that, at least. So just kind of a decline in our trust in institutions in general is the decline in the trust in science is part of that. But that comes to the question I have, and I encourage people to post in the Q&A box in Zoom other questions you might have for Dr. Parsons. But I find it paradoxical that even though in the last 50, 60 years we've seen a great increase in the availability of education, in the availability of information with the internet, you would think that we would have even more trust in science and knowledge and scientific truth, but we see the opposite almost, and that just seems paradoxical. I don't know if you could comment on that access to education has increased, but trust in education or scientific truths has decreased at the same time.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, as to the specific part about, the fears of nuclear war, probably the closest I've ever come to getting killed was not driving on the Houston freeways, but when I was 10 years old and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Down there in Cuba, they had intermediate range nuclear missiles that were tipped with 3 megaton devices. Atlanta and the Atlanta area where I live was very much within the range of those missiles. And had they been launched in my direction, I would be just scattered particles now and not here to address you on this topic. So that's the situation. As far as your general point, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a decline in the general trust in institutions. And I think because that is why increased education, the greater availability of education does not work or is not working as well as we would think that it would. Teachers, professors, scientists can talk until they're blue in the face about the virtues and the benefits of science and all this sort of thing. And of course, people use science more than ever. I mean, golly, we carry these devices all the time that represent remarkable science. You could do a history of the smartphone would give you a very significant part of the history of physics and chemistry in the past century. Yet it's such a cynicism about institutions, perhaps beginning at the time 50 years ago, due to Vietnam, due to Watergate and things such as that, an increasing cynicism about institutions and authority perhaps leads to this. That's an excellent insight. And so I may put that in my book, giving you credit, of course.
All right. Well, and it just appears, I was thinking the other day, Ronald Reagan in his first inaugural address said, government is not the solution to the problem, but government is the problem. So there's been a war against government and everything that government can produce. So it's no surprise that we've got people who's not completely trusting the government produced vaccines, because there's been a war against trusting government for at least 40 years. But yeah, so I encourage people to either unmute and ask questions. I think we can do that, Dr. Seahorn, right? Or type in the Q&A. Dr. Parsons is open to any questions.
Yeah, my computer audio has just not been working, so I guess I'll either need to read them or I'll need to be able to hear them on my phone.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah,
Please
I can
go
hear you
ahead.
fine. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
So, in your introduction, you were mentioned to have a certain number of degrees, and I heard you heard religion as one of your degrees.
Uh-huh.
And you also mentioned the ideas of creationism and intelligent design. Do you think that someone could be religious and support the ideas of science together? Or are they just contrasting ideas? Okay.
No, I don't subscribe to the warfare idea. Sorry if I interrupted you, but the old model of warfare that T.H. Huxley in the 19th century said that around the cradle of every new science, you find extinguished theologians like the serpents around the cradle of the infant Hercules. That was the old story, is that it was a zero-sum game, is that science and religion each could advance at the cost of the other. No, a greater proportion of scientists are atheists or agnostics than the general population, to be sure. But there are certainly people who are religious and scientific, and they do some outstanding and very good science. Even traditionally religious. Einstein, of course, was religious, but in a non-traditional way. Einstein referred to the universe as der Herr Gott, in other words, the Lord God. But by that, he did not mean a sort of anthropomorphic deity. He said he believed in Spinoza's God. In other words, he was a pantheist, all right? He identified God with the universe. But there are traditionally religious people that are outstanding scientists and have been in the history of science, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Hope that answered your question.
Yes.
Dr. Samuel Gladden asks, the Associate Dean of the College of HSH here at UHCL, how has the relationship between science and the humanities changed over the years, and how can each support the other?
That's an excellent question. Back in 1959, it was first noted that there were now two different cultures, distinct cultures, the literary culture and the scientific culture. And, the gap between the two seems to have simply grown in the meantime. And, one of the disturbing things, of course, is that it seemed to me that, many members of the academic left were humanities faculty that for some reason were attacking science. And I couldn't understand, I think certainly that we need to recognize that one can find both fascinating. Science, it seems to me, has everything, every aspect that should be appealing to a person in the humanities. For instance, one of my great interests is paleontology and the history of the earth, all right? The history of the earth is more magnificent, more sweeping, more epic, okay, with more twist of fate, all right, than any story created by human beings, all right? You can find within science, great triumph, great tragedy, astonishing genius, and astonishing genius that was neglected, ignored, and treated horribly. So science has all the drama and all of the creativity and all of the wonder that people in the humanities are looking for, and I think it should be explored. Yes, I think that people in the humanities can certainly and should certainly be encouraged to find inspiration within science, because believe me, it is there.
Thank you. Robbie Brewington asks, hi, Robbie, I haven't seen you in many years. Good to see you.
Hi, Robbie.
Does access to education really mean that people are better educated? I would think not, when so much of, quote, education, quote, is simply training to get a job. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's been one of my concerns too. It seems to me that in higher education in recent years, there has been much more emphasis upon now higher education as being preparation for a job, as though, universities should take down the university from the sign in front of their institution. And, I think that some people would think that we should not be the University of Houston Clear Lake, but should be the Bay Area Trade School. But this would be, I think, a very terrible thing, because universities have a special mission, not just to prepare people to work, but to prepare people to have something to work for, to have a life that is worth living. And that is what I think the humanities do. The humanities, I've told my students that nothing that I have is more valuable than my education. Nothing that I have has enabled me to enjoy life more than my education. And so, Shakespeare, Plato, all the great writers and artists and great music, that's what makes life worth living, and that's what the humanities gives you. And so, yes, I think that, there is more, certainly than just, the so-called practical on-the-job training. One of the things that humanities can give you is a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. And it is precisely this sense of awe and wonder that motivates the greatest scientists.
Good. Other questions? Feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. Dr. Crystal Seahorn, our Associate Dean here at HSH, asked, in 2018, a group of academics spent a year writing fake articles like the Sokol hoax you mentioned in your presentation. They had 7 of 20 papers accepted in journals. They said specialized in grievance studies. Can you speak more to the ethical complexity of these kinds of hoaxes and the doubt they can sow for credible research?
Well, I have to admit that I had a hearty laugh when I first heard of the Sokol hoax. However, it's one of those things that, yes, it starts to get concerning if it gets out of hand. I mean, is that what we're going to be doing now? Are we going to be doing the best we can? If there's any area of academic research that we happen to dislike, are we going to then attempt to sabotage that area of research by by achieving the publication of bogus articles, this sort of thing? So yes, I think that there is a considerable complexity there that needs to be studied. Perhaps, you know, every now and then something like this could wake us up. But in general, I think the way to deal with something you don't like is not to play a dirty trick on it, but to refute it, show that it's wrong, okay? Now, that may not be as much fun as shoving a pie in the face, okay? You know, the shoving a pie in the face, you know, may be more satisfying at a visceral level. But if you're a defender of reason, it seems to me that you have an obligation to use reason more than anything else, all right? Which means that we argue with people. It seems to me, I've told people, don't insult people, don't call them names, refute their arguments. That's the worst thing you can do to them, is refute their arguments, show them to be wrong, okay? Don't call them names, that doesn't matter at all, okay? Don't humiliate them. What good does that do? Show that their arguments are bogus. That's the worst thing you can do to them.
Other questions, other comments? Yeah, Robbie said again, the Sobel or Sokol hoax is truly scary and unethical. Yeah. Anyone else have a comment or a question for Dr. Parsons?
I promise not to abuse or humiliate you, just to refute your arguments.
I did. I'm sorry if I can't put this into words properly. I've been recently reading up on the involvement of other topics, like you've mentioned, creationism and big business involved with science, and most notably the progress of science. And one thing that I noted in one of the articles that I've read, and something that my dad has even spoken to me about, is that is that without the, I'm sorry about my dog barking, that the involvement, that if religion and things like politics weren't involved with science, we would have made much more progress than we would have made over the course of history than we are currently at right now. And I was wondering, do you believe that we could have come much further quickly or over the course of history, and maybe we would be even further now than we would have thought, than we currently are in technology? Or would the rate or pace of our, how do I say this, findings still be the same?
Actually, it's a fairly complex thing. Philosophers of science made a distinction back some years ago that I think is still legitimate, which is that we have a context of discovery and a context of justification. Now, as far as discovery and coming up with new ideas, they can come from all sorts of places. They might come from religion, they might come from politics, they might come from, well, you know, there's a famous incident in which, you know, a chemist was falling asleep and he had a dream. And this basically inspired him as to the shape of the benzene molecule from the dream. That's the context of discovery. Ideas can come from anywhere. This is, of course, why it's very important to have as diverse as possible a group of people doing science, people from all over, okay? All sorts of people doing science, because the different experience of different people can inspire all sorts of great ideas. However, when you go before other scientists and you are justifying your claims and saying why they should accept it too, you can't say, I had a vision, had a dream. That may have inspired your thought, but you have to do the hard work of experimentation, testing, rigorous observation, mathematical analysis, all this sort of stuff. You have to do all of that, and you have to do it very carefully and do it very well if you want to overcome the stringent skepticism of your colleagues. And that's much of what science is. It's institutionalized skepticism. Philosophy is much like that. If you go to present a paper at a philosophy conference, you can see the people sharpening their knives out there as you begin to lecture, okay? That's what you expect. It's not that they hate you. That's how we do it. It takes a village to make a discovery. And so, you know, that's what scientists do. So I would make that distinction. I wouldn't just say across the board, no science, no politics, no religion. Religion, your politics, your whatever might give you a great scientific idea, but you can't go before your colleagues and say, you should accept this hypothesis because it supports my religious convictions.
I see. Thank you.
Hope that answers your question.
Paris asks, if someone wanted to read a good book about finding common ground between secular and religious perspectives in our polarized society, what book would you recommend?
Gosh, I just can't think of any. I can't think of a single book that's ever been written by anybody. But oh wait, Paris and I wrote such a book back a few years ago. Came out in 2017, and it's called Polarized. If you wait on a second, I'll pull up a copy of it here. Hang on. Okay, well, even though this is reversed, this is Polarized by Keith M. Parsons and Paris and Donahue. The collapse of truth, civility, and community in divided times, and how we can find common ground. Okay, shameless self-promotion here. Okay, absolutely unabashed.
Couldn't resist.
Shameless.
Just could not resist.
And I think, yes, in the chat box, the Amazon link to that book was just posted. So people can look in their chat box and get it on Amazon.
We had one person that read just the blurb on Amazon and decided that we were horrible and gave us a 0 rating. But other people actually read it, and most of them seem to have some nice things to say about it.
Robbie had another comment / question. But when scientists put out misinformation, isn't that feeding the big business or big profits idea?
Oh, when scientists put out misinformation? Oh yeah, well, you know, remember that, you know, scientists can be as venal as anyone else. And that's of course what big tobacco and, you know, fossilized fuel companies did, is they went and hired their own scientists. You know, scientists have been known to sell out. Scientists have been frauds. When you do that sort of thing, you tend to be drummed out of the scientific community unceremoniously. You know, to me, that is an absolute betrayal. That's complete. That's total perfidy when you do that sort of thing. You know, it's a sort of a treason against all of the ideals of science. But it is done, of course. And as I've told people before, just because someone has PhD after his or her name does not mean that they are incapable of uttering nonsense.
And then she follows up, do you consider science to be self-correcting?
That's the wonderful thing about science. You know, there's science, of course, is, as I would define it, science is empirical inquiry conducted by communities that have a certain set of values. And those values are that every claim is to be rigorously vetted, rigorously evaluated by the best evidence that is available, and that evidence counts more than anything. So science essentially is what I would call a counterculture. Its values are opposed to those of the broader culture. In science, evidence matters. It truly matters, okay? It really does. And so individual scientists, intentionally or not, often, of course, say things that are wrong. I mean, you know, as Lewis Carroll observed, each of us can think of 6 impossible things before breakfast. all right? But what the community does, the community of scientists does, is that they take a look at our claims and subject it to merciless evaluation. And only those claims that can survive this merciless evaluation are tentatively accepted. And no scientific claim ever loses its tentative status. It is always tentative. Well, maybe there are some exceptions. The blood does circulate, by the way. But generally speaking, even relativity theory, even general relativity, even though it keeps being confirmed year after year, there are new confirmations of general relativity, it also remains tentative and conceivably could be refuted by future research. So yes, science is primarily an empirical inquiry that is done by communities of skeptics who will take your claims and will dissect them, minutely examine them, and will only accept them if they survive such an inquisition.
Any other questions? I don't know if we're limited to an hour, but other comments or questions from folks?
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
Dr. Parsons.
Hi, Selma.
Hi. Do you believe that everything can be proven by science, or do you have like doubts yourself that not every theory can be proven by science?
That to me is a very interesting question, and I haven't completely made up my mind yet. You have this term of, you have a disparaging term called scientism. Someone who supports scientism supposedly thinks that all legitimate questions are scientific questions, all right? Normally, of course, people will say, well, you've got ethics and you've got aesthetics and you've got, certain other things that cannot be solved by science. Of course, we know, and this is something that, really just occurred to me recently, that in some ways, taking a scientific perspective means that you have to settle for saying that you don't know certain things, okay? For instance, you have two people that have been equally careful and done everything they should do, that have, socially distanced themselves and worn masks and stayed home for the most part and been very careful during this pandemic, yet one catches COVID and the other does not. Now, why is that? Now, to give a scientific explanation, you would have to know very detailed information about each individual, about his or her biochemistry and genetics, and where precisely they have been, and the concentration of COVID particles. And well, these are things we just can't know. All we can do is say, give statistical information and say that masks and social distancing, this sort of thing, can make it more improbable that you will get COVID, but do not rule it out entirely. And of course, to say that something is very improbable does not mean it will not happen. On the contrary, to say that something is very improbable means it definitely will happen if given sufficient opportunity, all right? It will happen to somebody somewhere. So to be scientific, it seems to me, we have to accept that there are some things that we really can't explain other than maybe to give some general probabilities. The specific case we can't explain. This goes against people's desires. People who believed in witchcraft, for instance, they would say that the person who came down with COVID was cursed by a witch. That explains it, okay? So I guess that's the thing, is that if we are scientific, we have to admit that there are certain things that we don't know. And if we insist on having those, we have to turn to an explanation that is not scientific, okay? I hope that addresses your question.
Yes, it did. I just wanted to know your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Then we have another question from an anonymous attendee. Can you explain pseudoscience? What causes it to be non-science?
Oh, okay. Well, with pseudoscience, we would love to have some sort of a demarcation criteria. We'd love to have some set of necessary and sufficient conditions, which we could apply that would distinguish across the board. One size fits all, what is science and what is not. Unfortunately, the philosophical quest for demarcation criteria has not been successful, all right? various things have been proposed, and it has always been found that either they are too loose and let in things which, intuitively speaking, are not science, or they are too strict and when they would exclude things that, intuitively speaking, are science. I think all we can say is that there's good science and bad science, and we do definitely have criteria for bad science. I would take the label pseudoscience as applying to science that is so bad, that is so egregiously awful, so incompetently and horribly done that it should not even count as science. It's sort of like if I were to try figure skating, okay? If I were to attempt figure skating, I would do it so badly that it would not be figure skating, it would be falling on my face, okay? And so, therefore, Parsons figure skating is not even figure skating, it's so bad, all right? I would say the same thing applies to pseudoscience. The pseudoscience claims scientific status, but it's done so egregiously badly with such poor attention to confirmation and, such blindness to experimental tests and to evidence that it is such bad science that maybe we can say it shouldn't even be called even bad science, but just pseudoscience. Hope that answers your question, or addresses your question anyway.
Any last questions or comments? There's been some good ones here. Well, in that case, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Dr. Parsons for his excellent talk and excellent discussion. I want to also thank Dr. Samuel Gladden, the Dean of the College of Human Sciences and Humanities, and Dr. Crystal Seahorn, the Associate Dean, for sponsoring this lecture series. I want to invite everyone for our next presentation, which will be April 12th, also at 6 p.m. Dr. Sarah Costello, Associate Professor of Art History, will be giving the presentation Telling Better Stories, Archaeology, Object Biography, and the Public. And that one will be moderated by Dr. Maria Curtis, an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Cross-Cultural Studies. So again, thank you for everyone for attending, and thank you, Dr. Parsons, for an excellent presentation.
And thanks to everybody.
Actually, I'm sorry. I have one more question. This is really
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Who is
It's
this?
just Tiffany. I just really was itching to
Hi,
ask.
Tiffany.
When it comes to pseudoscience and things like that in that vein, for people who tend to